You met someone calm, reliable, the kind who texts back when he says he will, shows up on time, doesn't play games. And a week in, you catch yourself thinking, this is kind of boring. Here's the strange part. Normally, we call something boring when it's bad, but sometimes we call something boring simply because it's unfamiliar safety. Your brain spent years training on a different kind of relationship, one where you had to stay alert, read moods, catch the exact moment it was safe to relax. Then, suddenly, that job disappears, and your brain, out of habit, labels the empty space as nothing rather than as relief. Boredom at the start of a healthy relationship isn't a diagnosis, it's a withdrawal symptom. In psychologists Dutton and Aron ran one of the most famous experiments in the history of relationship psychology. Men were asked to cross one of two bridges. One was solid, stable, only a few feet off the ground. The other was a rickety suspension bridge swaying high above a canyon, terrifying enough that people's pulses genuinely spiked. On the other side of each bridge, an attractive female interviewer met the men and left her number in case you have questions about the study. Men who crossed the scary bridge called her back far more often than men who crossed the stable one, and they rated her as more attractive. Nothing about the woman changed. The only thing that changed was a racing heart from fear, which the brain mislabeled as attraction. Researchers reran versions of this experiment for decades afterward. Roller coasters, horror movies, intense exercise. The result held up every time. Any strong physical arousal, triggered by literally anything, gets happily credited by the brain to whoever happened to be standing nearby. Your body isn't always great at reading the label on its own sensations. Chemistry at the start of a relationship is sometimes just anxiety the brain mistook for attraction. Psychologist Dorothy Tennov coined a term for a state many people mistake for real love at first sight. She called it limerence. Intrusive thoughts about the person, inability to focus at work, checking your phone constantly, euphoria over the smallest sign of attention, despair over the smallest silence. Sounds romantic. Biochemically, it's actually closer to obsession than to love. And it holds strongest exactly when it's unclear whether the feeling is returned. Tennov specifically noted that limerence almost never forms around someone who reciprocates immediately and unambiguously. It needs uncertainty, the way fire needs oxygen. The moment a partner becomes reliably available and predictable, that exact state starts fading, even if actual affection hasn't gone anywhere. Stability kills limerence almost instantly, not because stability is bad, just because the uncertainty limerence feeds on simply isn't there anymore. Real closeness runs on a different chemical. Researchers studying attachment show that stable, trusting relationships are tied to oxytocin, a hormone that doesn't spike or crash. It works quietly, steadily, almost invisibly. The problem is your brain, trained on roller coasters, easily mistakes quiet and steady for empty and dull. This doesn't mean oxytocin is a weaker force than adrenaline. It just works slowly and cumulatively instead of in bursts. You notice its effect months later, not in the moment. The day you realize you haven't checked your partner's phone out of anxiety in ages, or replayed their last text looking for hidden meaning. Real intimacy doesn't produce adrenaline, it produces calm. And calm, at first, can feel empty, simply because anxiety used to occupy that exact spot. And this isn't limited to romance. Friendship, family, even your relationship with yourself run on a similar pattern. Sounds abstract? Here are 7 situations where this gets very concrete. She dated someone who texted non-stop, then vanished for days. She left, emotionally drained, sure she never wanted to go through that again. A month later, she met a calm, consistent man who replied within the hour and never disappeared without warning. 3 months in, she told a friend, "Things are good with him, but there's no spark." Her friend asked, "And the spark, what was that exactly with the last one?" She sat with that question and didn't have an answer. In her friend group, relationships get discussed on a drama scale. The more stories about fights and dramatic makeups, the more alive a couple looks to everyone else. A couple where nobody yells and nobody cheats looks suspiciously flat by comparison. Friends sometimes even pity them behind their backs. "It's so quiet with those two. They'll probably break up out of boredom eventually." Nobody ever asks the obvious question back. Why does a healthy conversation about a relationship need a scandal in it at all? He grew up in a house where love meant unpredictability. Warmth one day, ice-cold silence the next. As an adult, he met a partner who treated him consistently well, every single day. The first few months, he waited for the catch. He assumed she was either hiding something or just hadn't shown her real side yet. Consistent kindness registered not as a gift, but as a threat on delay. He even provoked small arguments out of nowhere, almost instinctively, just to test. Will she snap now? She never did. That scared him more than if she had. A couple's been together 6 months. The first few weeks were pure euphoria, butterflies, the inability to stay away from each other. Exactly at month 4, right when the relationship officially became stable, one of them started noticing irritation and boredom. Not because anything actually broke, because the phase of uncertainty that kept their nervous system on alert had ended. He started looking for the problem in her. Too predictable, too easy, too figured out. Even though 6 months earlier he'd used those exact same words to describe finally having a normal relationship. On a dating app, she swipes through profiles at night. A calm, kind-looking face. Swipe left, not interesting. A sarcastic bio hinting at a complicated personality. Swipe right, intrigued. She doesn't notice she's repeatedly choosing a potential source of anxiety over a potential source of peace. Then, genuinely wondering why her dates keep ending the same way. A bio that says, "Looking for something real," feels desperate to her. A bio that says, "Not looking for anything serious," feels like a challenge worth taking. She calls it intuition. It's actually just an old habit of her brain hunting for familiar uncertainty. An elderly couple's been married 42 years. Neighbors joke sometimes. How boring. Same thing every night. Tea at 9, the evening news, lights out early. When her husband had a stroke, she didn't leave his bedside for 3 straight weeks. You can only call that boring from the outside. From the inside, it has a different name entirely, the one people usually reserve for real love. She has a close friend she hasn't had a single fight with in 15 years of friendship. Sometimes she catches herself thinking, maybe we're not close enough, since we've never had one of those big blow-ups you make up from afterward. She's confusing the absence of drama with the absence of depth. They're two completely different things that just rarely show up together in a story that's fun to tell at a party. So, what actually helps? 1. Give a calm relationship a minimum of 3 months before you rule it boring. Withdrawal from anxious chemistry physically takes time. It's not a 1-week verdict, and it's definitely not a verdict you can make on one uneventful Tuesday. 2. Notice exactly when the boredom hits. If it shows up right after a moment of closeness, honesty, or mutual support, that's not a compatibility problem. It's a withdrawal symptom from an old dose of adrenaline, not a verdict on the relationship itself. 3. Separately identify what's actually pulling at you, a spark or anxiety. Ask yourself, am I excited because I feel good or because I'm not sure what happens next? The honest answer is usually clearer than it first seems. 4. Consciously relabel the feeling. What reads as boredom is often safety you haven't learned to recognize as valuable yet, simply because you never had the chance to before. Chaos looks like passion. Calm looks like boredom. But once everything else runs its course, only one of those two is still standing, and it was never the chaos. Subscribe. Next week, we cover how to actually stop confusing anxiety with love, in practice, not just in theory.